Hello. Welcome to Perceptions of Disability, the largest minority in the world, presented by Sam Drazin. My name is Juliet Enyanwu, SIP Program Specialist, and your moderator for this incredible, informative breakout session. First, a few logistics. So this webinar will be recorded and it will be archived on the conference agenda after the conference for about a month. So please be sure to check out any recordings that you might miss today. Closed captioning is available by clicking on the CC button on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. The interpretation icon in the same area will provide access to Spanish translation if you need it. Please feel free to interact using the chat. I will collect all your questions, and if we have time at the end, we will definitely answer any questions that come in the chat. Please ask specific questions in the Q&A as well. And with that said, Sam, I will turn it over to you to kick it off.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks, Juliet, for the introduction. Welcome to this breakout session, Perceptions of Disability, the largest minority in the world. Give me one moment. I'm going to pull up the slides for today's presentation. So excited to be here. Thank you to SIP, the Supporting Inclusive Practices Project, for inviting me to be a presenter during this incredible Mission Possible conference. Today's breakout session is Perceptions on Disability, really focusing on how disability is sometimes misunderstood as really the largest minority in the world. My name is Sam Drazin. I'm your presenter today. I am a former classroom teacher. I taught 3rd grade. I taught 5th grade. I did some work in special education at the middle school level. I left the classroom about 8 years ago to take this work to more of a national lens. I present to educators like yourselves. I present to families and parents. I present to students. If they work or if they're part of a learning community, I've probably presented to them. I'm also the founder and executive director of a nonprofit organization called Changing Perspectives, and I live with my own disability. I was born with a rare facial difference called Treacher-Collins syndrome. I've had 8 facial reconstructive surgeries, and I also wear a special bone conductive hearing loss. So I like to kind of say that in this area of disability and inclusion, that I've been on both sides of the desk. I've been an educator with a disability, and I've been a student with a difference and a disability. I really hope that this isn't the end of my relationship with all of you, but rather just the beginning. On this slide, I've concluded my email address, and I welcome and encourage you to reach out if you'd like to have a private conversation with me about what I'm going to share, how I could support your school, how I could support your district. And you're also welcome to connect on social media platforms. A little bit more about my professional background with Changing Perspectives. As I mentioned, Changing Perspectives is a 501c3 educational nonprofit organization. Our goal is to partner and collaborate with schools and districts across the country to promote social emotional learning and really help to cultivate inclusive and equitable learning communities with a lens or focus on students with disabilities. We do our work in 3 ways: by curating social emotional learning and disability awareness pre-K through high school curriculum resources, offering professional development trainings like this one today, and supporting schools in how they outreach and engage families through a number of family engagement programs. Our website is up here on the screen, and I also encourage you to connect and follow us on social media. Before I get started in the meat of today's presentation, just want to remind everybody that you can use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen to have a dialogue as I share. I'm a huge fan of using the chat while I present. Feel free to throw in your aha moments, throw in resources, throw in something that maybe really resonates with you as I share. And then Juliet will also be managing our chat box with or not our chat, our Q&A. So at the bottom of the screen, if you have a specific question about something that I bring up, something you're wondering a little bit more about, feel free to throw that in the Q&A, and we'll see. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can in our hour session. If not, we'll make sure we follow up with participants on their specific questions. So to get started, I want everybody just to take a quick moment of reflection. If you want to close your eyes, that's fine. However, you need to stop and reflect. But this presentation is about disability being the largest minority in the world, and thinking about our own perceptions or preconceived notions or our current mindsets around disability. Because we can't create inclusive learning environments if we don't first address our mindsets and our perceptions about our students with disabilities. So what I'd like you to do right now is think of one person in your life. It could be now, it could be in the past, it could be someone you interacted in your professional realm, someone you interacted in your personal realm, that lives or lived with a disability that had an impact on you. And if you are so inclined, I invite you to share that in the chat, who that person is and what that impact was on your life. So again, thinking of one person in your life, now or in the past, personal or professional world, that lived with a disability that had an impact on you. And I'm just going to give us a moment to think and drop those in the chat. And as you do that, what I want us to be recognizing is that every one of us has interacted, has had a relationship with, has somebody in their lives with a disability that's impacted us in one way or another. And as people are throwing in the chat, I'm already noticing it's a lot of personal connections: son, daughter, brother. Wow, lots of personal, lots of family members. So again, feel free to keep those coming in the chat. You're welcome to respond to each other. Thanks, Dr. Erica, for sharing what it taught you. Karina, thank you for sharing. I know it takes some vulnerability to share. But I also think as we consider how we can bring this work back into our learning communities, whether that's a district, an individual school, this is a great simple exercise just to get everyone thinking about and reminded that disability touches all of us in one way or another. So disability is really the largest minority group in the world. And what makes disability such a unique minority group are the intersectionalities between people who live with disabilities and all other marginalized groups or all other facets of identity, right? So I kind of like to think about our bodies made up as what I call an identity puzzle. So if we kind of visualize our body made up of puzzle pieces, right? And each puzzle piece houses a specific component of our identity, right? Disability might be one for certain individuals. But people with disabilities span all races, all genders. Individuals who live with disabilities span all socioeconomic groups. What's really, really unique about disability being the largest minority in the world is that you could be born with a disability and or you could acquire a disability later in life due to an injury, due to an accident, due to an illness. Disabilities are prevalent in all family structures. Individuals who, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of religious background, right? So disability really is the largest minority in the world. Now, one of the things that makes disability really interesting too is that within the largest minority in the world, disability kind of falls into two different buckets: invisible disabilities and visible disabilities. And when we unpack this a little bit more, and there's a few things that we need to consider, right? So when we're thinking about and interacting with and considering inclusive practices for students with invisible versus visible disabilities. So when we think about invisible disabilities, they're often not obvious when you look at someone at first. And because they're not obvious, oftentimes it can be harder to empathize with. In my work with students, especially, it can be very hard for them to empathize with an individual who maybe has an emotional behavioral disturbance or another invisible disability. Like any disability, there's a range, and we need to recognize that within the invisible realm, there is a range as well. The way in which one person's invisible disability manifests for them isn't the same for the person next to them. It may take time to fully realize what someone's disability is, what accommodations, modifications, and needs they may need. And sometimes we need to be more creative in what our accommodations are. It isn't as obvious, it isn't as tangible or physical or blunt. So we really have to take time to get to know people with invisible disabilities and really kind of explore what is the best way to support them. Now, on the other side of this, we've got visible disabilities. Visible disabilities are disabilities that we can see at first glance. They're obvious when you look at somebody. Now, as a result, it may be easier, or we may think it's easier to create an accommodation. We might assume what somebody needs based on the way they look, based on the way they walk, or based on the way they talk. You could be born with, or you could acquire a visible disability later in life. And we have to be really mindful that we don't wrap an individual's entire identity around their visible disability. That oftentimes judgments can be made very quickly when we look at someone with a visible disability. So we've got disability as the largest minority in the world that spans all races, all genders, all ages, all socioeconomic groups, et cetera. And then within that, we've got the invisible disabilities, but we have visible disabilities. So I want to share with you a short video clip now. It's about 20 seconds long. It's actually a French advertisement. And what this video clip shows is what the world would be like if the world was designed for people with disabilities and people without disabilities were the minority. I'm going to say that one more time. What this video depicts or illustrates is what the world would be like if the world was designed for people with disabilities and people without were the minority. And so when we think about the title of today's presentation, Perceptions on Disabilities, I think this is a really good reminder about how our societies, our schools, our institutions are designed for people without disabilities, and people with disabilities try to fit in. As you watch this in the chat box, please note any observations you make about what the individuals without disabilities are trying to do that become incredibly difficult.
Hello, I'd like to open a bank account. One is the loneliest number that you'll ever do. Two can be as bad as one. It's the loneliest number since the number one. Access for everyone. When your world lights up, EDF.
So in the chat, take a moment and note, what do you notice in this video that makes it challenging for individuals without disabilities? Great, here they're coming in now. So access was limited. So you might have noticed things like when the individual went into the bank to open a bank account, that individual was speaking by voice, but the bank teller was speaking using sign language. You might have noticed that the individual towards the end who goes into the library and opens up the book is all in Braille. So what I like about this short video is it's a great reminder about how our societies are designed and how we need to be mindful about how we augment or modify things to be more inclusive to those with disabilities. Yes, I love Evelyn, great. A view into how they feel, perfect. So the way we perceive the world is based on our own past experiences. So as someone like myself, as a white hearing impaired male, my experience impacts my perspective on things. And we need to recognize that everybody, all of our colleagues at the schools that we work with, have had their own past experiences when it comes to interacting, supporting, educating students with disabilities, and that those experiences are going to drive and influence one's perception of people with disabilities. Now, language is incredibly powerful. Language has the power to create inclusion, and language also has the power to perpetuate exclusion. And when I say language is powerful, I want us to think about not just spoken language, but language in an IEP, language in a 504, our body language when we interact with others. So language is the way in which we communicate with other people, and within our school systems, we communicate in a variety of ways. And so we want to be mindful of the language that we're using in those various situations, and how language can help to move to a more inclusive learning community, and also the power that language has to continue an exclusive community. So let's unpack this a little bit more. What does language allow us to do? Well, language allows us to communicate with others, our thoughts, our feelings, information, beliefs, etc. Language also has the ability to foster group identity. So when we think about individuals with disabilities, language has the ability to create an identity for a group that can oftentimes empower individuals, make them feel more self-confident, greater self-advocates of themselves and their disability. Language also has the ability to communicate our beliefs, our understandings, and our values. Maybe those values are inclusion, for example. So language allows us to do a lot of different things. Now, one specific type of language I want to talk about when we're talking about perceptions of disability is this idea of person or people first language. This is something I'm sure you've already heard about. But again, as we think about our perceptions of disability, all of this is going to drive a culture of inclusion or a culture of exclusion in our school communities. Person first language is essentially a type of linguistic prescription that puts the person before the diagnosis. So this allows us to describe what a person has or lives with rather than what a person is. So again, it kind of goes back to that idea I talked about the identity puzzle. If you're more of a visual learner, right? This idea of an identity puzzle. I am a person with a hearing loss. That is one puzzle piece of my entire identity puzzle. It is not my whole puzzle. So by really thinking about person first language, we're able to ensure that we're thinking about the whole person, the whole child, and recognizing that their disability or diagnosis is really just one piece of who they are. So some considerations to think about when we think more about language. One, in the blue box here, the way a person with a disability may refer to themselves may be different than the way they would be referred to by someone without a disability. So oftentimes in the autism community, An individual who lives with autism may refer to themselves as autistic. But if you are not a part of the autism community, you would most likely refer to that person as a person with autism or a person who lives with autism. So it's important to recognize our own perceptions, what communities we're a part of, to ensure that the language that we're using, again, is inclusive and respectful based on our previous lived experience or current lived experience. We also need to be mindful that the language around disabilities has and will continue to change, right? Oh, whoopsie. This is not stagnant. This is always changing. And we need to recognize generational gaps with our colleagues. We need to recognize cultural gaps if we're working in a school system that works with students from a variety of cultures or ethnicities. We need to be aware of kind of the way in which different generations and cultures perceive disability, and that that's most likely going to influence the language that's being used. And then on the last box here, we need to recognize the variance within each disability group and culturally appropriate and expected language. In other words, I would most likely not be a part of the deaf community because I don't sign, I speak through voice, right? So within each disability community, there is going to be variance in the language that's used and that sense of identity and belief and value. So in speaking about language, in speaking about perceptions of disability, mindsets, how disability really is diversity and the largest minority in the world, we have to make sure we address one key topic here, which is the concept of ableism or ableistic perspective. To get us thinking here, I want to show you another short video clip. This is from the ABC sitcom Speechless, which was out a couple years ago. And I recognize that we all might have different definitions of ableism or what ableism is. But as you watch this clip, it's very short, it's like 10 seconds. As you watch this clip, when the mother here is talking to the school principal about how her son who uses a wheelchair is going to enter the school building, please drop into the chat why you think I chose this clip to kick off this part of the workshop around ableism, or how does this clip connect to ableism? Whoops.
Let's go to school, shall we? Where's the wheelchair ramp? A garbage ramp?
It's not just a garbage ramp.
No, it's a garbage and my son ramp.
Okay, crash course in basic human dignity.
Let's play a little game I like to call trash or person. Are you Dr. Miller? Trash? Are you a person?
You're a person, Dr. Miller.
Of course, I am.
Of course you're a person.
Oh, doctor.
So again, in the chat, drop in a thought that you have about why I chose this short video clip to think about ableism. So let me unpack ableism a little bit more, and then you might have an, oh, it looks like we have someone. Thanks, Susan. It's not obvious, but nobody calls it out. Parent advocacy. Something as basic as how you enter the building matters a lot. Exactly right. Great. Now they're coming in. Thanks, everybody. Keep the conversation going. So ableism is essentially discrimination or social prejudice of disability, of individuals with disabilities, right? So in that short video clip, there was social prejudice because that individual student had to enter the building from a different vantage point, the back, using the ramp that they bring the garbage out in, right? Social prejudice. And the root of ableism or ableistic perspective is on this idea that people with disabilities either need fixing, they need to be cured of their disability, or are not equal to those without disabilities, right? So this mother's son is not equal to his or her peers without disabilities because this child has a disability and needs to enter the school through a garbage ramp. And I would say, if you haven't seen Speechless, I don't know if anyone wants to drop it in the chat, their thoughts, but I would say Speechless is a great kind of funny show to watch that kind of explores ableism in a more kind of humorous way. So here's another example of ableism. It's a little fuzzy on the screen, I apologize, but it's a short, a little cartoon here. So this individual in the wheelchair says, "Could you please shovel the ramp?" And the guy in the green hat who's shoveling the stairs says, "All these other kids are waiting to use the stairs. When I get through shoveling them off, then I will clear the ramp off for you." And the kid in the wheelchair responds with, "But if you shovel the ramp, we can all get in." So again, this individual is acting in perhaps an ableistic way, assuming that this child here who uses a wheelchair is less than these students who don't, and therefore is prioritizing shoveling the stairs before the ramp. Now, within ableism, there's two things we need to consider: unintentional ableism and intentional ableism. And I think this is really an important thing to consider, especially as you, perhaps leaders in your school or your district, are thinking about how can we, mission possible, how can we create more authentically inclusive learning communities for all of our students? So let's talk a little bit about this. So what might be unintentional ableism? So unintentional ableism might be things like helping someone with a disability without their permission. Because we are assuming that they are less than. We are assuming that they are incapable of. We are using our perception to make an assumption or a judgment about what an individual with a disability can and cannot do. Using the R word, which would be retard or retarded, as a joke, or sometimes we hear it in media, in shows, in songs, right? So using words like that as a joke is unintentional ableism. This, I would say, is unintentional ableism, right? I think that this individual was simply looking out and going, okay, all these kids are going to walk up the stairs. I need to do the stairs first. But what this individual did not recognize is that if he shovels the ramp, it actually helps all the students. Another piece of unintentional ableism is a lack of disability representation in media. And since we're on this call and we're focusing on schools, I would even say a lack of disability representation in our curriculum in schools. The posters we have on the walls, the books that we have, the other sort of graphics that kids are being exposed to, right? In a way that's unintentional ableism. Now, on the other side of this, examples of intentional ableism. That's going to be things like making fun of someone with a disability intentionally, forced integration and or forced segregation. And I know some people are like, forced integration, like, what does that mean, right? So that would be something like, Johnny, you're going to play with Sally and you're going to get along and it's going to be great. We want inclusion to be organic. We want inclusion to be a part of the fabric of our learning communities. Intentional ableism is also forced segregation. All these students, you're going to be over here. All these students, you're going to be over here. And lastly, intentional ableism would be putting requirements in place that intentionally exclude those with disabilities. So doing an activity at the school, choosing a field trip that is not accessible to all students. There are times where we do that, but we need to be mindful of that. So when you're working at your school and you're helping your colleagues to really maybe consider their own ableism or ableistic points of view, think about how ableism really falls into two categories. And there may be things happening at your school. And if you want to drop them in the chat, you feel comfortable with that, go for it. There may be things happening at your school or your district that are actually unintentional ableism. And so how do we help educate others? How do we inspire others? How do we engage others in this conversation? To ask the hard questions and to reflect on the role in which ableism and ableistic perspectives and actions are maybe holding back or are a barrier to making progress in more inclusive learning communities. So what are some things we can do to avoid ableism? Or what are some things that you can do in your school communities? Well, one, be aware of our own and help others be reflective on their own unintentional ableism, actions, practices, behaviors, beliefs. Believe people. Whoops, sorry. We need to be able to believe people. Sometimes we might not believe a parent. We might not believe a student. Believe others when they tell you what they need. Don't assume, and this could be especially hard for those visible disabilities. Don't assume what someone needs. Don't assume what someone's abilities and or inabilities are. Ask them, engage. Look for opportunities to educate others about ableism, whether that's at a staff meeting, whether that's through parent programming, whether that's through opportunities to talk to students about these topics. But we can't make changes if we don't know what we're talking about. Look for ways to learn more about disability perspective, current, past, and future lived experience. There's a lot of disability advocates now, individuals who live with disabilities who are sharing their stories, sharing their perspectives on social media. And look for opportunities where you can be an advocate for greater accessibility in your learning community. So how do we move forward with this work? Over the last 40 minutes or so, I've shared a lot with you. I hope that what I've shared is some new inspiration for you. I hope you have maybe like one new aha moment about, ooh, I never thought about disability like that before. I also hope that maybe there's some nuggets of information, some food for thoughts, some resources that you can take back to your schools and districts to address everybody's own perceptions of disability. Help everybody better understand how disability is essentially just a greater form of diversity and the largest minority in the world. And that disability has all those intersections with other groups of identity. So we talked a little bit about disability being the largest minority in the world. We talked about language, written, verbal, body language, and how language has the ability to create inclusion, but also push back on inclusive practice. And then just most recently, we talked about ableism and how ableistic perspective is one specific component that we may need to address in our learning communities in order to get over that mindset hump to create inclusive practices in action. So moving forward, and feel free to take a picture of this slide. I think there's a lot of good stuff here. So as you think about the work you do in your school or your district, there's a few things that I would encourage you to really consider in order to take this idea of a first step of inclusive practice is addressing perceptions of disabilities and mindsets. So one, what are the current perceptions of disabilities by stakeholder member? So when we think about our school communities, you've got three stakeholder groups. You have students, you have educators, and you have families. So how can you check the pulse, I like to say, to figure out how each of your stakeholder community groups within your learning community already perceive disabilities? Maybe your school puts together a survey that goes to students, a survey that goes to educators, a survey that goes to parents and families. Maybe there needs to be a separate survey that goes to the parents of kids with disabilities. Maybe you need to hold a focus group or have an event where people come in and share and you document things. But in order to figure out what areas of mindset, what areas of language that you need to push back on and better educate others on, you need to figure out what's your baseline. The next thing I would encourage you to really consider is how does language create inclusion or perpetuate exclusion in your learning community? Of all the people who are on this workshop today, we all are coming from our own schools or districts. And we need to recognize that each school and or district is its own microcosm. It has its own culture. It has its own climate related to students with disabilities. So think specifically about your school, your role, and what you've noticed around the way in which language is used to create inclusion or perpetuate exclusion. We already talked a little bit about this, but what role do you see as ableism playing in your learning community? And I noticed that I was talking about ableism, several people were sharing some very recent experiences in the chat where they witnessed a form of ableism or ableistic action or beliefs in a learning community. And then lastly, really consider how can you support your colleagues in exploring their perceptions of disabilities? I know I've said this 1, 2, 3, or 4 times already, but I can't stress enough. In order to create inclusive communities, we have to start with really addressing those perceptions, those mindset barriers, those stereotypes of our learning community and all of the stakeholders within the group. So what I'd like to do now is take some time to address the Q&A box. So Juliet, if you are there, I'm going to ask if you can help facilitate this next section. So for folks, I love the conversation that's happening in the chat. It's so energizing just to see different folks sharing their experience, the things they're noticing. If you have a question, feel free to drop it in the Q&A box. As well as the chat, if you're more comfortable that way. And Juliet, do we have any questions?
We do, Sam. So
Great.
we have one question that came in for you, Sam, is what was the biggest challenge during your time as a classroom teacher, and how did you overcome that challenge?
Ooh, what a good question. So I went straight from undergrad into teaching. So I was one of those brand new in my early 20s in teaching. And I think one of my biggest challenges was I felt like my preparation to become a teacher helped me differentiate curriculum. It helped me understand the IEP roadmap, but it actually didn't really help me think about cultivating an authentically inclusive learning community. And so one experience I like to share is within my first couple years of teaching, I had a student who had some very obvious disabilities. And I remember the special educator and the administrator coming up to me in those pre-service days in the summer and just said, okay, this is what you're gonna need to do. You're gonna need to set up a table on the far back corner of the classroom, and you're gonna need to put bookshelves around it. And that's where that student is gonna sit with her one-on-one paraeducator all day. And as a young, naive teacher, I'm like, great, I'm doing inclusion. And after a little while, as I'm sitting in the classroom and I'm facilitating learning with my students, I realized this isn't inclusion. This is physical inclusion, maybe. The student is physically in the classroom, but this is not authentic inclusion. This student does not feel like they have a sense of belonging. And I think one of my biggest struggles as a teacher was, how do I do that? Which is one of the reasons why, after a few years of teaching, I left the classroom to embark in this work.
Thank you so much for sharing about that classroom experience, Sam. I believe we have another question come in. So another participant put in the Q&A, what kinds of programs do you offer to schools, or what kind of professional development do you offer to schools?
Yeah, so we do a whole bunch, and I don't know, Juliet, if you want to maybe throw the Changing Perspectives website in the chat. But essentially we do, one of the things I think is that oftentimes educators don't know how to talk about disability, right? It's interesting, right? In school, we talk about diversity, we talk about race all the time, and people are generally relatively comfortable talking about that. But for whatever reason, we've been conditioned to believe that it's not okay to talk about disability. So one of the programs we offer is access to a disability awareness curriculum, which is giving educators curricula that they can use to talk to students about disability, to make it okay. We also do a variety of professional development trainings, both in person and virtual. I have a whole list of workshop descriptions from, what is inclusion to cultivating a more inclusive environment. And one of the things that I think makes Changing Perspectives somewhat unique is that we partner with each school. So we customize our trainings to each school to really meet the needs of their school. We've done a whole bunch of really unique things. Like one thing we did at one school, I was actually down outside of Los Angeles, is we did a panel discussion. It was a family program, but we did a panel discussion where parents from the community who had students with disabilities shared their experience as a parent of a child with a disability. It was so incredibly powerful. And then for professional developments, we've done an hour to a full day. We've done activities where we take teachers through disability simulation activities to help them better understand what it's like, a whole host of things. So I definitely encourage you and invite you to reach out to me. Happy to talk more about it.
Thanks for sharing a little bit about this organization. I dropped the link in the chat for everyone. We have a few more questions. What
Great.
recommendations do you have to start the conversation about ableism?
Yeah, I think ableism, in a way like racism, can be a very triggering word for some people. And so we really want to think about how we engage in this in a scaffold and an intentional way to really think about the risk that we're asking people to engage in, and really think about vulnerability and emotional safety. Because the last thing we want is for people to put those defensive walls up, or the last thing we want is for it to go sour and then people have a bad taste in their mouth about doing this work. So the first thing that I might suggest is, doing again some preliminary data collection, right? Doing a survey to your staff, like, what do you think ableism is? Collect definitions. If you have 50 people at your school, I bet you're going to get 50 different definitions for what ableism is, right? We can't really talk about it until we first know what we're talking about. So I think it's really thinking about low risk opportunities to engage, really ensuring that when we facilitate these conversations about ableism, we are staying judgment-free. Because again, we all perceive things through our own past experiences. And someone might be doing a lot of things that are unintentionally ableistic, but not even be aware of it. And calling them out right away, they may get defensive. So I think it's about low risk activities, engagement opportunities. It's about engaging information or kind of judgment-free brainstorming, getting folks to share. I think videos could be really, really important, short, like those little clips that I shared, find a whole bunch of clips and give people an opportunity to just interpret them. So I'd say those are a few starting places.
Thanks, Sam, for sharing some of those strategies. We have one more question, and please
Can I actually say,
Yeah.
Sorry, Julia, I just want to draw people's attention to the chat that Robin just shared. By having people remember a time that an assumption was made about them or when they were an outsider in a group. And I love that, right? Like ableism is so much bigger than just disability. And that's part of what I would also encourage folks to do is like get people to think about ableism from a more macro lens, right? It's about feeling not included. It's about feeling like there's something wrong with you. It's about feeling like you're intentionally excluded, right? I bet if you ask all your staff to think about a time in middle school when they were a student where they felt left out, everyone's going to have an experience like that. So make it universal to everybody.
Yeah, I love all these strategies. I think with me, I try to take an inquiry stance, and I think that's where we're all coming from. And so thanks again for adding those comments in the chat. Please continue to add additional questions in the Q&A. We have one more for you, Sam, but we have some time, so feel free to add additional in the Q&A. So this question says, how do you encourage and motivate teachers to accept resources and training information on inclusion that parents might share with them? Oftentimes, they are not as welcoming when it's coming from families.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I've worked with a few different kind of parent advocacy groups. And I know sometimes there's, what's the right word? I don't want to say animosity, but sometimes there's some friction, let's say, between a parent advocacy group and the school system. And so I really think this starts with at the beginning of the school year, thinking about ways that a school builds relationships with families and thinking about how a school builds relationships with all families. I think oftentimes when we think about family engagement, we immediately think about kind of the status quo, the norm of the school community. And oftentimes parents of kids with disabilities don't fit into that. And so how do you think about family engagement opportunities from a lens of inclusivity? How do we think about family engagement opportunities from a form of collaboration and partnership rather than an us versus them, rather than a we are going to dictate information and they will listen and sign off on the IEP and that's all that will happen. I think to encourage this, it's about kind of what you were saying, Julia. It's an inquiry-based experience. I think the sharing of stories is incredibly powerful. But get to know families, get to know their stories, get to know their perceptions of their child. And I think also times, and I remember being a teacher too, we do identify certain students based on their disability, right? Especially if you maybe have a small school, it might be you have one kid who lives with Down syndrome and that kid is known for his or her disability. And that could be very off-putting to parents, and then teachers are kind of put off by that as well. So again, it goes back to that identity puzzle. It goes back to that sharing of back and forth resources and that open communication.
Okay, thank you so much, Sam. I'm just looking at the Q&A to see if there are any other questions. We have about, let's see, 6 more minutes before our closing. So if there are any questions that you may have put in the chat that we missed, please feel free to add it to the Q&A. We still have a couple of minutes with Sam before we wrap up. And so I'll give it about maybe 30 seconds just to have folks give you some time to add additional questions that might come up in the Q&A. If not, we will close out. Or Sam, if you have any additional information to share with us.
I was just going to put a plug that tomorrow at this amazing conference, I'll be doing another workshop if you're not sick of listening to me talk. And tomorrow we're going to jump from mindsets, which is what we focused on today, to inclusion and action. So tomorrow, my breakout session, same time as today's breakout session, is going to focus on really what is inclusion. Today, we kind of talked about perceptions of disability. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about what is inclusion, why is inclusion important, how does it support all learners, and also really look at next steps and really think about those practical strategies. Once you kind of go over the hump of mindset barriers, practical strategies to implement some inclusive practices in your school. Before I hand it back over to you, Juliet, I'll just thank everybody for joining in. Again, my goal is to, I always say with my presentation, I just want to change 10% of your thinking, right? If we can always try to augment or modify or improve our practice by 10%, that's where we're going to see long-term change. So I hope that everyone I was able to do something to shift by 10%. Don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm more than happy to connect with anybody at a later time to talk more specifically about their work and the learning community that they support.
Sam, thank you so much. I think you met your goal. So thank you so much, Sam, and thank you everyone in attendance. Be sure to join us for Inclusion Fusion with DJ B Diamond. I think that starts at 11 o'clock. Also, you can connect in the social lounge with like-minded attendees and also post on social media using the hashtag SIPCon 2022. Please make sure to also complete the survey, our conference survey, towards the end of the day. I will drop the link in the chat just for you to have, but please make sure after today, we would love your feedback. Take a couple of minutes to please fill out that survey. If there are no other questions or nothing else coming up in the chat, thank you so much for joining us with in this time, and we will see you in some additional presentations or with DJ B Diamond. Have a great rest of your morning, everyone.